This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Really excited to have you guys back on the show with me today. I was supposed to have an interview with a guest that I'm really excited about talking to, but because of some scheduling conflicts, we had to change the date for the recording, so I decided I was going to do something on my own today. It is summer break, and as a teacher, I still stay pretty busy during the summer, but I do a lot of reading, and this was rather unexpected, but I began the summer by reading G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island, and I have now fallen down the rabbit hole of trying to understand better the Federal Reserve and all of the negative consequences that that has on our society. And as all of you know, well, maybe not all of you, but as some of you listening know, the Federal Reserve is the nation's central bank. It is responsible for all of America's monetary policy, and it has been responsible over the last couple of years for literally printing out of thin air trillions of dollars. Now, we use the term printing money in a colloquial sort of way. The Federal Reserve doesn't actually print money anymore. Instead, it's all numbers on a spreadsheet that these banks and other financial institutions have. But it is the Federal Reserve that is the driver of the increase in the supply of money that leads to higher prices that we've seen over the last couple of years. And so I've ordered a couple of books on the Federal Reserve, and this summer I'm really going to try to hammer this down, understand it better, make sure that I can articulate it better, because I really do believe that the Federal Reserve is at the heart of almost all of the problems that we are facing in our society, and in particular, its inflationary monetary policy that does not benefit the average person in any way. Now, the term inflation itself is one that is almost universally misunderstood. We really do have to distinguish, unfortunately, in the modern world between two types of inflation: monetary inflation, which is an increase in the supply of money relative to the quantity of goods and services in an economy, and price inflation, which is the increase in prices of goods and services. And these two are absolutely connected. So when the money supply is increased, it dilutes the value of the money that is already in circulation. Against the supply and demand issue, the greater the supply of money, the less value that each individual unit of that money has, which will ultimately lead to higher prices. And it is the Fed that has been the driver of this. Now, everyone in the political class and in the media establishment seems to have forgotten that this is the fundamental definition of inflation. Now, the irony of this is that I teach 7th grade social studies, and the textbook that we use, and the textbook that we use in my class is from Texas Curriculum Institute, and it's called History Alive, the Medieval World and Beyond. And they give the accurate definition of inflation in that textbook, which is an increase in the money supply relative to the quantity of goods and services in an economy, which will lead to higher prices. And one of the examples that they give is in the 14th century, there's a very famous king from Mali, Mansa Musa, one of the wealthiest people that ever lived, because there are large quantities of gold in West Africa. And he converts to Islam, and he makes a Hajj from West Africa to Mecca in what is now Arabia, or what was then Arabia, now Saudi Arabia. And he travels all throughout North Africa with a large amount of gold. And as he's giving gold out to all of these leaders in Northern Africa, it actually depresses the value of gold, because a greater quantity of gold is released into the economy. And so the value of the gold that already existed decreased. It couldn't purchase as many goods and services before. And my textbook accurately identifies that as a form of inflation. So my 7th graders can understand that inflation is not the increase in prices, it's the increase in the money supply that leads to higher prices. But of course, politicians and people in the media want to shift the blame to corporations and to private financial managers and things of that nature, and say that it's just because of their greed or whatever that these prices are getting higher. And now, there is, like with everything else, a grain of truth to that story. Of course, these corporations love all of this easy money that floods into the economy by the Fed, and it's good for investments, or at least it's good in the short run for investors and for stock prices and things like that. But what's really driving these prices higher is an increase in the supply of money. Now, it's been over the last 100 years that traditionally every economist understood inflation to be the increase in the money supply. That was just what it meant. Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, has a series of lectures that has been compiled and published by the Mises Institute in a little booklet called Money and Inflation. And I would highly recommend it to everyone. You can get it on the Mises Institute's website or on Amazon. It's only about 100 pages, and he does a great job of explaining money and how inflation works. Now, these were all given back in the early 1960s, okay? So if I'm doing my math on that correctly, we're talking like 60 years ago, Ludwig von Mises was giving this series of lectures. And here's what he has to say about the way that the definition of inflation was subtly shifted from an increase in the supply of money to something that resembles corporate greed or higher prices. He says this, the first problem, the one which is not recognized as a monetary problem by the government, by official spokesmen and writers, is that of the increase in prices, the so-called inflation. One of the most important features of the new economics, once simply known as bad economics, is the change in the meaning of terms. So again, what Mises is saying here is he's talking about how the meaning of the word inflation has been subtly shifted by economists. And he says this, not so long ago, inflation meant a considerable increase in the quantity of money and money substitutes in circulation. The effect of such an increase was always a general tendency for prices to move upward. Everyone knew this and admitted it, and certainly the government knew it too. Today, the official terminology has been changed. We have to realize that the term inflation is used today in popular discussion of the subject in a way which is very different from the meaning attached to it in the past. People now call the increases in prices inflation, while in fact inflation is not the increase in prices, but the increase in the quantity of money that brings about the increase in prices. He goes on, people nowadays don't talk about the increases in the quantity of money. This is a subject that the representatives of our official doctrine do not wish to mention. They speak only of the fact that prices are moving upward. This, the effect, they call inflation. They do not mention at all the preceding fact, the cause of the upward movement and the increase in the quantity of money. They imply that government has nothing to do with it, that government wants only to keep prices stable. They simply assume that the upward movement of prices and wages, which they call inflation, is caused by the wickedness of people outside government, by bad people who are asking higher prices. Again, this was written 60 years ago. And this is the exact same line of argumentation that is taken lockstep by every single politician in the Democratic Party and by almost every single pundit in the corporate press. This is just the standard definition of inflation. And when I talk to people about inflation and how it's hurting them, and how it's hurting their family, they automatically blame the companies that are charging higher prices without realizing that over the last couple of years, literally trillions of dollars have been willed into existence by the Federal Reserve. So because of this dramatic increase in the supply of money, all of the prices that we see in our economy on goods and services that we purchase every day have increased with it as well. And calling inflation the increase in prices is actually confusing cause and effect. The cause is the money printing. The effect is the higher prices. And so if we want to stop prices from spiraling out of control and getting higher and higher, then we have to stop printing the money, which is why everyone that's concerned about social justice and the welfare of the American working class and those that are poor, those that are struggling to get above the poverty line, those people that are old, that are living on a fixed income, literally everybody, except for the wealthiest people in the world, the financial managers, the politicians, people like this, literally everybody is negatively impacted by inflation, the increase in the supply of money. And the only mechanism that we have for stopping this from happening is to end the Fed. We have to do something to curb the power of the Federal Reserve and get back to a sound or stable money supply. That's what absolutely has to happen. And it's such a shame to see both Democrats and conservatives complaining about the increase in prices and offering various policy proposals to try to stop that, none of which have anything to do with the reason why the problem is caused in the first place, which is the Federal Reserve's printing of money. It's so embarrassing to see these progressive Christians on Twitter talk all the time about how we need more welfare programs and about how the corporations are screwing over the average Americans and we need more government regulations and we need more centralized control of the economy without ever once mentioning the fact that maybe, just maybe, we should not give a small board of directors the ability to determine how much money is in our economy. I don't know. That's just my thought. But as I was thinking about all of this stuff, I stumbled across an article on a website called Zerohedge. Now, if you guys don't read Zerohedge, I highly recommend it. It's an excellent source of news. It's like it's kind of like a news website, but it's also kind of like a blog, in that they collate these articles that are from all of these websites around the internet. And you're going to be familiar with a lot of the sites that they like. They got the Mises Institute, they got antiwar.com. They have a lot of really great websites, and they post a lot of this content on there. And they do a lot of financial news as well, really looking at Federal Reserve and really looking at Fed policy and how that impacts interest rates and how that impacts the money supply. Great website. I would highly recommend checking it out. But there was a really good article that was published on Zerohedge just the other day that I want to explore in today's episode. Now, the article, I guess, was originally published over at the Epoch Times, and the author was Jeffery Tucker, but I saw it first on Zerohedge, so I got to give Zerohedge the credit, but I will put a link to this article on Zerohedge, which will also send you to the link at the Epoch Times. I'm not very familiar with the Epoch Times, other than I know that they have some, I guess, conservative or libertarian leanings, and the articles that I've read from Epoch Times on a Zerohedge have tended to be pretty accurate when it comes to breaking down economic issues. So this particular article, which I want to read because I think it perfectly encapsulates how inflation has negatively impacted everybody in America, is called "The Price of Everything, the Value of Nothing." And the reason why I want to do this is, again, the motivation for me to study this issue and to understand it is, as I've already said, I've begun to realize just how central to all of the problems facing not just American society but the world are related to Federal Reserve monetary policy. I really do think that this is at the root of a lot of the most evil things that are happening around the world right now. And as Christians, I believe that we have an obligation and a responsibility to speak out against that which is evil. Because regardless of whether or not you're a socialist and you believe in welfare programs, or you are a libertarian and you believe in no government, the Federal Reserve really does rig the game against the average person. And both progressives and conservatives, and then, you throw in your libertarians or whatever, everybody is equally impacted by this in a very negative way. And almost nobody knows exactly how this works. So if you're brand new to the concept of inflation as an increase in the money supply, or you want to know why everything's so expensive when you go to the grocery store and why it's harder for you to put food on the table for your kids, this article does an excellent job of explaining how that phenomenon actually works. So I'm going to read through the article and comment on it a little bit. This is not going to be a very long episode today, but I just thought that this was so perfect, and you guys need to see this. So this is the article, "The Price of Everything, the Value of Nothing," authored by Jeffery Tucker at the Epoch Times. He says this: "The inflation of the past 3 years has been devastating for households and businesses running on small margins. It's all the more frustrating that during those years, we kept being told that it is transitory, softening, calming, cooling, settling down, and essentially not much of a problem anymore. We look back and now know that that was never true. In reality, 3 years is a very short time for a major currency to lose at least a quarter of its domestic purchasing power. In the post-war period, it took from the war's end until 1965 for that to happen. This was also the loss from 1982 to 1992, from 1992 to 2000, and from 2001 to 2012. And again, this is the thing that people have to understand. There's a big difference between your nominal income, or the nominal amount of money that you have in your bank account, which is like literally the number of dollars that you hold, and the real amount of money that you have in your bank account, or the real amount of money that you earn, or the real amount of money in your savings, which is the purchasing power of that money. And this is what progressives universally misunderstand. It does not matter how much money you make, or how much money you save, or how much money you have. What matters is the purchasing power of the amount of money that you have. So if you only make $1,000 a year, but that $1,000 a year can buy you more goods and services than you can make at $100,000 a year with an inflated currency, then the $1,000 a year amount of money actually makes you economically better off. And the problem with inflation is that it lowers the purchasing power of money. You cannot buy as many goods and services as the value of the dollar decreases, because they create more of it. Again, this is basic supply and demand, but because most Americans don't understand fundamental basic economics, they completely get this wrong. So this is what we're talking about. As the government inflates the currency, the money that people have loses their purchasing power. So if you are a thrifty person and you like to save a lot of money, you might keep money in a savings account for 20 years, but over the course of that 20 years, that money has lost its purchasing power. So in effect, you've lost money. You've lost your ability to buy goods and services in the market because the Federal Reserve has arbitrarily created more money and it's devalued the amount of money that you've saved, which automatically, again, for people that are talking, for the progressive Christians that whine and cry about consumerism and capitalism and all that stuff all the time, this mechanism of being able to give people the ability to print money winds up hurting people that are thrifty and that save and that try to be financially responsible. And this is exactly what they're talking about at the introduction to this article. The dollar has lost a massive amount of purchasing power because the Federal Reserve constantly expands the supply of money. Now, he's going to go on to talk about this period of time before COVID. He says, that's hardly a record of stable money, but it is manageable from the standpoint of accounting and psychology. We were used to it. What's happened to the dollar over the past 3 years is a more extreme loss than anything experienced since the late 1970s. Back then, the dollar lost a quarter of its value between 1975 and 1979, which roughly fits with current experience. Keep in mind that the current numbers are likely underestimated because they exclude interest rates and completely miscalculate categories such as rent and health insurance. Or do you believe that health insurance costs less today than in 2008? Moreover, the inflation index cannot account for the full impact of shrinkflation, quality changes, and hidden fees. In any case, and even using conventional numbers, the bad news is that the dollar of 1913, and 1913 is important because that's the year that the Federal Reserve Act was passed through Congress, has a purchasing power of about 3 cents today, which means that from the beginning of the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. That is a 97% devaluation of the American dollar. So let's assume that there is someone who was very thrifty in 1913 that found some way to live into the year 2024. So they saved a bunch of money. They put it in a savings account in 1913 and they didn't touch it. Whatever amount of money they had in their savings account in 1913 would only purchase 3% of the goods and services that money could have purchased in 1913. Again, this shows you that under these inflationary policies, it's very difficult to justify saving your money and being thrifty, which is, I think, a part of the reason why they continue to inflate the money supply. He's going to go on to say, any purchasing power loss sets in motion a gravitational pull against living standards. It means working harder, scrambling more, adding income to the household revenue stream, and otherwise never quite getting ahead. It also eats into savings by punishing rather than rewarding thrift, as should be the case. But for this to happen in such a short period of time from 2021 to the present is extremely damaging to economic structures. It also damages our understanding of the world around us. You know this feeling. Not long ago when you were out shopping, you had a sense if something was a bargain or a ripoff, overpriced or underpriced, something to snap up or leave on the table. Now everything seems too expensive, but you cannot know for sure. I see people all the time at the store who pick up an item, look at the price in shock, pull out their phones to price compare, discover that it is pretty much in line with market standards, decide whether they must have the thing, and then reluctantly put it in their cart with some element of disgust. And again, just to make this point very clear, I talk to a lot of my friends and family. I mean, everybody that I know complains about higher prices everywhere they go all the time. I mean, this is a very normal topic of conversation in 2024. Everyone's so frustrated with how expensive everything has become, but no one seems to understand why it's so expensive. And it's inflation. It's the increase in the money supply that was brought about by COVID and that's been in effect since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. He goes on, inflation turns the once happy experience of being out and about in the commercial marketplace into a grind and an annoyance. For many people, it is utterly terrifying because they are having a hard time staying ahead no matter what. Have you ever been in a foreign country using an unfamiliar currency and attempted to haggle with a vendor on the street? It is extremely disorienting simply because you are out of your element. You don't know if you're getting a good deal or being pillaged. This is because the prices that sorry about this, my computer Here we go. This is because the prices you are quoted are detached from any context that you know. Inflation brings this problem home. Suddenly, everything feels unfamiliar and you lose your footing. Societies that have dealt with extreme versions of hyperinflation like Weimar in 1922 utterly fall apart. We are nowhere close to that problem but still experience elements of the results. Even inflation on our current level can usher in dramatic social and cultural changes. It was the inflation of the 1970s that converted U.S. households from one income to two and now three. Now imagine this problem from the point of view of a business manager. Every good or service you need for your business is nothing but up in price. It blows up the accounting ledger and your employees are demanding more not only to pay their own bills, but also because they know of another firm vying for their services. Again, we hear a lot of people talking about the good old days when a family of four in the United States could afford to have a house and two cars and send their kids to school all on one income. The reason that we cannot do that today is because of inflation, because the value of the dollar has slowly been eroded through inflation. And I sometimes wonder, not that I don't think that women should be able to go out and work, because I absolutely do. And again, if you look at my life, my wife is in business marketing and makes way more money than I do being a teacher. So I love the idea that women can go out and compete in the marketplace just like everybody else. I think that that's really great. But I know that there are a lot of people that resent having to do that. And the reason why they have to is because of the Fed and because of their inflationary monetary policy. And again, this author does a great job of demonstrating how this necessarily has to lead to higher prices, because all of the capital goods that entrepreneurs use to make the goods and services that you want to purchase become more expensive. And since all of those things become more expensive, they have to increase the cost of providing that good and service so that they don't go out of business. Because in all honesty, a lot of small and medium-sized businesses run on very small margins. A lot of progressive Christians that don't understand economics don't just completely misunderstand this, so they have to increase their prices, and then that means that all of their employees are having to pay much higher prices for consumable goods and services, and so they demand more wages. So this is kind of like this wage price spiral where the prices get higher, people demand more wages, the prices get higher, people demand more wages, and it's all really bad, and it creates a lot of chaos in our economy. And so to that end, it's something that has a massively negative impact on everybody. Here's what he goes on to say. Well-heeled and highly capitalized businesses fare much better in this environment. Those living off credit, paying high rates, and running very thin margins lose out to the competition that is in a better financial position. The pain is intensified given that in the year before the Great Inflation began, many small businesses were forcibly closed by the government in the name of stopping a virus. Having barely gotten through that period, they then faced a barrage of other absurdities. They dealt with capacity restrictions, supply chain breakages, and then mask mandates on employees and customers. Following that, there was a looming threat emanating from a Biden administration edict that was later reversed by the Supreme Court to make their employees take an experimental shot. The wounds of this period are still obvious everywhere, but life didn't return to normal. Instead, this inflation began, which hit the core of business operations in another way. Every business facing inflation has to figure out the key issue, how to absorb the blow. End user consumers must face higher prices, but how high can they go before a quiet revolt begins to happen? Contrary to what you hear, no business wants to raise its prices on the consumer. There are some exceptions for luxury goods and so on, but this is hardly the norm. They do not like making their customers unhappy. There have been some innovations in how this hot potato gets passed on. It can come in the form of smaller portions and packages, ingredients of lesser qualities, or new fees snuck in here and there. Many restaurants found that they have far more flexibility in raising prices on beer, wine, and cocktails because these are things that people get regardless and are unused to examining the price structure carefully before purchasing. Though this worked for a while, but is not a complete solution. Plus, the public has become newly aware of these fees. They start to infuriate people who incorrectly blame the businesses rather than the inflation themselves. The Biden administration has even begun a kind of verbal war against fees, threatening to turn regulators loose on the problem. For the most part, people take for granted the existence and meaning of prices and the information they convey. The network of pricing structures govern our lives in ways we do not entirely notice. Think of your own consumption habits. For generations now, Americans habitually go through vast amount of paper towels to clean every spill and wipe every counter. We think nothing of it. But if those towel rolls were $15 each, think what that would do to your kitchen habits. You would likely discover the merit of cloth towels. It would change everything. This once small example pertains to vast amounts of your life. We go through toothpaste like it's nothing, but if the tubes were $50 each, you would see people suddenly discover the merits of straight baking soda, which is a fraction of the price, cleans as well or better, and lasts far longer. In a complex modern economy with elaborate capital structures, prices serve as information-generating systems for the world that allow for rational use of resources throughout the whole of the production structure. Without them, we would all be flying blind, producers and consumers alike. Accounting would be impossible, and hence there would be no chance for rational calculation. Economizing would be hopeless. The societies that have variously attempted to implement what's called socialism, meaning the abolition of ownership and market-based exchange of capital goods, have discovered that the result is nothing but chaos. Again, to his point, this is one of the fundamental tenets of the Austrian School of Economics. Prices are nothing but signals. That is all that they are. And that signal helps us to determine the relative value of a good and service and an economy as it is related to both its supply and its demand. Prices are absolutely essential. And when the Federal Reserve prints trillions of dollars, that has a massive impact on the structure of prices in an economy, making it impossible for us to value goods and services, to determine what they are actually worth based on the forces of supply and demand. It's crazy. He goes on to finish out the article. Every system-wide hit to the price system is an attack on economic rationality. Socialism as a system is one version, but there are many others. Price controls rob producers and consumers of valuable information they need for businesses. These take many forms, for example, minimum wage laws that force people out of the job market and make it impossible for businesses to operate as we are seeing in California today. Inflation also amounts to an attack on the functionality of prices themselves. With stable money, prices work as guides to action, tools of rationality, points of connection between people who otherwise do not know each other, and as building blocks of a global communication network that requires no central management. Blowing up the price system and distorting it with inflationary pressures reduces its ability to make our lives better and eats away at productivity. It's just another form of robbery. For this to hit just after lockdowns is a deep attack on U.S. economic vitality. We'll all be paying a heavy price for many years. So that's the article right there. An excellent explanation of how inflation impacts all of us. Now, as a Christian, I am called, and I deeply believe that all of us as Christians are called to radical voluntary charity, meaning that we have an obligation and a responsibility to take care of those in our society that are the most vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, people that are on the edge of poverty and that can't get out because of circumstances that are beyond their own control. I think we have an obligation to all of those people, and this is what I think that the progressive Christians halfway get right. They understand that charity is central to the Christian ethic. The problem with the progressive Christians is that they want the government to be the monopoly provider of charity, which is completely against the clear teachings of the New Testament that we as Christians are supposed to, as individuals and as a church, voluntarily give up our resources in a decentralized way to help those that are in need. So in Matthew chapter 25, when Jesus says that you need to feed the hungry and to give water to the thirsty and to clothe the naked and to visit those that are in prison, he's not saying create a government program that will do that for you so that you don't have to do anything except for live in luxury and pleasure. He's saying you need to go and do that because that's a part of being a Christian. You have an obligation to do that. And it's the same thing that when you read 1 Timothy 5 and 6, I've done an episode on this before as well. In 1 Timothy 5, what does Paul say? That if you don't take care of needy family members, then you're worse than an unbeliever. You should just stop pretending like you are a believer. But then he goes on in chapter 6 to say, if you have the privilege of being wealthy, not that wealth in and of itself is an evil, but if you have the privilege of being wealthy, then you have a greater responsibility to help those that are in need and to offer charity to those that are truly struggling. And this has to be done on an individual by individual basis in a decentralized way through voluntary charity. It cannot be enforced or compelled by a central government like the progressive Christians want it to do. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want somebody else to solve all of the problems in society, and all they have to do is vote and complain about people who have different opinions than them on the internet, which is not a good way to think about these issues biblically. But let's assume for just a moment that we do want the government to have these welfare programs, and we do want the government to have these entitlement programs or transfer payments or whatever to help people that we think are disenfranchised. Okay, just for the sake of argument, we'll accept that premise. wouldn't we at least want those transfer payments and that charitable money and the welfare programs to be based on sound money? So that when we gave somebody who was struggling financially money, they could save and invest responsibly without having to worry about how the value of that money is going to be wiped out or depreciated over the course of 10 years because the Fed continues to print more money. I mean, even if you do believe in monopolized charity, which I don't, you should at least want that monopolized charity to be backed by sound money. And it's the same thing for people like me who believe in radical voluntary charity, who believe that Christians and the church in general have an obligation to help those that are in need on an individual by individual basis in a responsible way. I want to get the most out of that money. When I'm giving to an organization or to a program or to an individual that we truly believe needs help, I want that money to actually be a stable source of value for them. I want them to be able to save, and I want them to be able to invest, and I want them to be able to know that this money is going to have a stable amount of value over time. But because of this inflationary policy, it just doesn't. And if you think about all of these people that are living on the poverty line, or I have several friends, we were, it's both a blessing and a curse, but we were only able to have one kid. But I have a lot of friends that have 3, 4, some even 5 kids, and they're really struggling right now. And all they wanted to do was raise a family. And 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, when they started having kids, everything cost a lot less because there was less money in the American economy. They couldn't have predicted that the Federal Reserve would have gone on a $6 trillion spending bender because of COVID-19, which is both the responsibility of Donald Trump and the CARES Act and Joe Biden and the American Recovery Plan. Billions of dollars injected into the economy, mostly to go towards banks, financial institutions, and very powerful corporations. It's a Cantillon effect that these people received all of this inflated money at prices that reflected pre-inflation levels. It's such a sick and toxic system, and almost no one understands how it actually works. And now the average American has been completely screwed by all of these distortions of the price system. This is what inflation does. This is what happens when you give the central bank a monopoly power to print money at will for social and political reasons. It's got to stop. That's the only reason why, if you are a libertarian, a progressive, a conservative, whatever, that is the reason why we have to end the Fed. That's the reason why we should always be in favor of the abolition of the Federal Reserve and a return to sound money. We need an economy and we need prices that are stable, that allow people to make responsible and frugal economic calculations, and that don't just benefit the wealthiest and most powerful bankers and politicians and financial managers and corporate executives. We cannot have an economy that is rigged towards these people if we want the average person to live a happy, healthy, prosperous, responsible life. Well, I hope this episode helped you out a lot. The way that the definition of inflation has changed over the last 100 years has masked a lot of the problems that we're facing in our society today. And I think that it is absolutely essential that every single American understands how this system truly works. And I hope that today's episode was educational and it allowed you to see exactly how sick this system is. Well, I appreciate you guys listening to the end of the show. I am going to be at Freedom Fest this year. I was supposed to go last year. We had a death in the family and I had to miss it, but I'm definitely going to be there this year. Freedom Fest is a giant convention of libertarians. A lot of huge names are going to be there this year, and LCI will have a table. We're going to be in Las Vegas from July 10th through July 13th. It's Wednesday through a Saturday. So if you happen to be at Freedom Fest, come find the LCI table and you can meet me and talk with me. I'm really excited about going and meeting a lot of people and promoting my podcast, promoting our organization. So if you are in the area and you want to come check that out, I will be again at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas from Wednesday, July 10th through Saturday, July 13th. And as always, if you guys have any questions for me about anything at all, please let me know. I love you guys, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.